The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched my husband of 23 years slip his wedding ring into his jacket pocket and walk toward the woman who had once shattered our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was choosing our daughter's wedding day to finalize his betrayal. Around us, guests continued their celebrations, oblivious to the fact that the mother of the bride was watching her world implode in real time. What Derek didn't know was that in 18 months I'd be standing before many of these same people, delivering a toast that would leave him speechless and reveal just how magnificently a woman can rise from the ashes of her own destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Natalie's wedding dawned with the kind of pristine October sky that wedding photographers dream about. Golden light streamed through the windows of our riverside home as I stood in my dressing room, fastening the pearl necklace Derek had given me for our 10th anniversary. The irony of wearing symbols of his love on the day he would abandon me wasn't apparent yet. At that moment, I was simply Vanessa Hartwell, mother of the bride, consumed with the thousand details that go into creating the perfect wedding day. Natalie burst through my bedroom door wearing her silk robe, her dark hair already pinned in elegant curls by the stylist who'd arrived at dawn. Her face glowed with the radiance that only comes from being completely utterly happy. My heart swelled watching her, remembering the chubby-cheeked toddler who used to play dress-up in my closet, declaring she'd have the most beautiful wedding in the world someday. "Mom, you look incredible," she said, spinning me around to admire the midnight blue mother of the bride dress we'd selected together at Bergdorf's 3 months earlier. The silk felt luxurious against my skin, and the color complemented my auburn hair perfectly. Derek had grumbled about the price, but I'd insisted. After all, your only daughter gets married once, and I wanted to look worthy of standing beside her on this momentous day. "Not as incredible as you're going to look," I replied, smoothing a stray curl behind her ear. "Connor won't know what hit him when he sees you coming down that aisle." Natalie's engagement to Connor Walsh had been a fairy tale romance from the beginning. They'd met during their final year at Yale, both studying business, both from families that moved in similar social circles. Connor came from old Connecticut money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted its presence. His family owned Walsh and Associates, a prestigious consulting firm that had been guiding Fortune 500 companies for 3 generations. More importantly, he adored Natalie with the kind of steady, dependable love that reminded me of Derek in our early years. The wedding planning had consumed the better part of a year. As someone who'd once coordinated high-end corporate events before Derek convinced me to focus entirely on our family, I'd thrown myself into creating the perfect celebration. The Willowbrook estate, with its manicured gardens and elegant ballroom, provided the ideal backdrop. I'd personally overseen every detail, from the imported French roses to the custom-designed menu featuring locally sourced ingredients. Helen Nakamura, the wedding planner we'd hired, often joked that she felt more like my assistant than the lead coordinator. Derek had been present for the major decisions but distracted in a way that seemed different from his usual work preoccupations. During cake tastings, he'd check his phone constantly. At the venue walkthrough, he'd seemed eager to leave early. I'd attributed his behavior to the stress of a major acquisition his firm was pursuing, a deal that had been consuming 12-hour days for months. Looking back, the signs were obvious, but love makes us willfully blind to patterns we don't want to see. The morning proceeded according to our carefully orchestrated timeline. The bridesmaids arrived for hair and makeup, filling the house with laughter and champagne giggles. Natalie's best friend Brooke helped coordinate the photographer's shots of getting ready, while my sister Patricia arrived with her characteristic efficiency, having driven down from Boston to help with any last-minute emergencies. "Where's Derek?" Patricia asked as she bustled into the kitchen, setting down a bag of emergency supplies that included everything from safety pins to antacid tablets. "Shouldn't he be getting dressed soon?" I glanced at my watch. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, and it was already past noon. "He went for a run this morning and said he had a few errands to handle. He'll be back in plenty of time." Even as I said the words, a flutter of anxiety moved through my chest. Derek was many things, but he'd never been the type to cut timing close on important occasions. The photographer captured what would become my favorite image of the entire day during those getting ready hours. Natalie sat at my vanity while I fastened her grandmother's vintage bracelet around her wrist, both of us reflected in the antique mirror that had belonged to my mother. Our faces wore matching expressions of joy and anticipation, completely unaware that this moment represented the end of one chapter and the brutal beginning of another. Derek returned home at 2:30, his timing precise enough to avoid appearing negligent but late enough to create a subtle undercurrent of tension. He looked unusually polished for someone returning from errands, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his skin bearing the fresh scent of expensive cologne. When I mentioned he smelled nice, he brushed off the comment with a distracted kiss on my forehead and disappeared into his dressing room. The ceremony itself unfolded like a dream sequence. Natalie looked breathtaking in her grandmother's restored lace gown, which we'd spent months having altered to fit her perfectly. Connor's face when she appeared at the end of the aisle confirmed that every detail had been worth the effort. His eyes filled with tears as she approached, and even Derek seemed momentarily moved by the emotion of the moment. I sat in the front row, dabbing at my own tears as they exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Natalie promised to support Connor's dreams while pursuing her own, to be his partner in adventure and his comfort in difficulty. Connor pledged to love her not just in their moments of triumph, but especially during their challenges, to choose her every day regardless of what life might bring. Their words seemed to carry extra weight in the golden afternoon light, witnessed by 200 family members and friends who'd gathered to celebrate their union. The cocktail hour transitioned seamlessly into dinner, with guests mingling on the terrace, overlooking the estate's gardens. The weather cooperated perfectly, allowing us to take advantage of the outdoor spaces we'd specifically chosen for their romantic ambiance. Derek played his role as father of the bride flawlessly during the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with the charm that had served him well in business and social situations throughout our marriage. It was during the cocktail reception that I first noticed her. Claudia Romano stood near the bar, wearing a dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and provocative. Her dark hair swept into a sophisticated updo that showcased diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head. She looked exactly as I remembered from 2 years ago, when Derek's affair with his college girlfriend had nearly destroyed our marriage. We'd worked through that crisis with months of counseling, rebuilt our trust through careful steps and difficult conversations. Derek had sworn she was completely out of his life, a mistake from his past that would never be repeated. Seeing her at Natalie's wedding felt like ice water flooding my veins. My first instinct was to find Derek immediately, to demand an explanation for her presence at our daughter's most important day. But guests kept approaching me with compliments about the beautiful ceremony and elegant reception. My mother of the bride duties required me to smile graciously and accept their praise while my mind raced with questions and possibilities, none of them good. I finally spotted Derek near the garden entrance, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Ryan Fletcher, his best friend and business partner. Ryan's expression looked troubled as Derek spoke, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something that resembled concern or even disapproval. Their conversation ended abruptly when they noticed me approaching, both men quickly arranging their faces into more neutral expressions. "Everything all right?" I asked, my trained hostess instincts keeping my voice light despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. "Just discussing the Morrison account," Derek replied smoothly, though his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "You know how Ryan worries about details." Ryan's mouth tightened slightly at this explanation, but he simply nodded and excused himself to find his wife. The interaction left me with a growing sense that something significant was happening beneath the surface of our celebration, something that Derek was working hard to keep hidden from me. The dinner portion of the reception proceeded without obvious incident. My speech about Natalie included stories from her childhood, observations about her relationship with Connor, and hopes for their future together. Derek's toast was shorter, but equally heartfelt, welcoming Connor into our family and expressing pride in the woman Natalie had become. To anyone watching, we appeared to be the perfect family celebrating a perfect day. It wasn't until the dancing began that Derek's behavior became impossible to ignore. During the father-daughter dance, I watched him whisper something to Natalie that made her pull back slightly and search his face with concern. Whatever he said caused her smile to falter momentarily before she recovered her composure, but I noticed Connor watching the interaction with a puzzled expression. When Derek returned Natalie to Connor's arms after their dance, he walked directly to me and requested our traditional parents' dance. As we moved together to the slow melody, his body felt tense and distant despite our physical proximity. His eyes kept drifting over my shoulder towards some point across the room, and his responses to my comments were distracted and mechanical. "Derek, what's wrong?" I asked finally, my voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't overhear. "You've been acting strange all day." He looked down at me then, his blue eyes holding an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined regret with resolve in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. Vanessa, he began, then stopped, his jaw working as if the words were physically difficult to form. Derek, my voice came out smaller than intended. We need to talk. Later, after the reception, his tone carried a finality that sent cold fear racing through my system. The rest of our dance passed in silence, my mind spinning through possibilities, while my body automatically followed his lead across the polished floor. When the song ended, Derek stepped back with a formal smile that looked more like a grimace and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the center of the dance floor as other couples moved around me. Helen Nakamura appeared at my elbow with the organizational skills that had made her one of Connecticut's most sought-after wedding planners. "Time for cake cutting," she announced, gently guiding me toward where Natalie and Connor waited beside the three-tiered masterpiece we'd ordered from the French bakery in Greenwich. The cake-cutting photos would later show me standing beside Derek with a smile that looked genuine enough for family albums, though I can clearly remember the effort it required to maintain that expression. Natalie laughed as Connor playfully dabbed frosting on her nose, their joy so pure and uncomplicated that it made my chest ache with protective instinct. Whatever Derek needed to discuss, it could wait until after our daughter's perfect day concluded. The evening continued with all the traditional wedding elements we'd planned so carefully. The bouquet toss, won by Brooke amid squeals of laughter from the assembled single women. The garter removal, which Connor handled with gentlemanly discretion while Derek looked on with what I now recognize was the expression of a man already mentally absent from the celebration.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was during the last hour of the reception that everything finally unraveled. Most of the older guests had already departed, leaving primarily the younger crowd, who would continue celebrating long into the night. I was coordinating with the caterers about packing leftover cake for Natalie and Connor to take on their honeymoon when Patricia grabbed my arm with unusual urgency. "Vanessa," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "we need to talk. Right now." She pulled me toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, her face flushed with indignation. "I just saw Derek in the parking lot with that woman. Claudia, they were by his car, and Vanessa, they weren't just talking." The world tilted sideways as her words sank in. "What do you mean they weren't just talking?" "I mean he was kissing her. And not like old friends catching up." Patricia's eyes blazed with protective fury. "I mean like a man saying goodbye to his lover." The champagne flute in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Through the ballroom windows, I could see Derek's silver Mercedes in the parking lot, but both Derek and Claudia were nowhere visible. My legs felt unsteady, as the implications of Patricia's words crashed over me like a physical blow. "Are you certain it was them?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. "Positive. Vanessa, what are you going to do?" Before I could formulate a response, Derek appeared in the ballroom doorway. His face looked pale but determined as he scanned the remaining guests until his eyes found mine across the room. He approached with measured steps, his expression carrying the weight of impending confession. "Vanessa, we need to talk now," he said quietly, ignoring Patricia's presence entirely. "Can we step outside?" My sister started to object, but I held up a hand to stop her. Whatever Derek had to say, I needed to hear it directly from him, even if I already suspected the devastating truth. We walked through the French doors onto the terrace, where we'd shared cocktails with our guests just hours earlier, when I'd still believed we were celebrating the beginning of something beautiful, rather than witnessing the end of everything I'd built my life around. The October air had grown cool with approaching night, and I wrapped my arms around myself as Derek turned to face me. Behind us, music and laughter continued inside the ballroom where our daughter danced with her new husband, blissfully unaware that her parents' marriage was about to implode on her wedding day. "Claudia and I are leaving together tonight," Derek said without preamble, his words cutting through the evening air like a blade. "I'm sorry, Vanessa, I know the timing is terrible, but I can't pretend anymore." The words hit me with physical force, even though Patricia's warning had prepared me for this moment. "You're leaving? Tonight? On Natalie's wedding day?" "I didn't plan it this way," he said, his voice carrying what might have been genuine regret. "But Claudia's job is transferring her to San Francisco next week. This is our chance to start over properly, without sneaking around or making promises I can't keep." "Promises you can't keep." My voice rose despite my efforts to maintain control. "What about the promises you made to me? What about the counseling? What about rebuilding our marriage?" Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with 25 years ago, before success and compromise had worn away his softer edges. I tried, Vanessa, I really did, but I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for years, and neither have you if you're honest about it. The truth in his words stung more than the betrayal itself. Our marriage had become a carefully choreographed performance, two people who'd learned to coexist peacefully while pursuing separate interests and maintaining separate emotional lives. But admitting that felt like accepting responsibility for my own abandonment, and I wasn't ready for that level of self-examination. So you decided to handle this by having an affair, by bringing your mistress to our daughter's wedding. Anger began replacing shock, giving me strength to stand straighter despite the trembling in my hands. I brought her because I wanted her to see this part of my life, to understand what I'm walking away from, Derek said, his words suggesting he saw this as some kind of romantic gesture rather than a calculated cruelty. And because I needed to be sure I was making the right choice. And are you? Sure, I mean. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wedding ring, the platinum base.
Yeah,
I'd slipped onto his finger 23 years ago, in a ceremony much smaller, but no less hopeful than the one we'd just witnessed. I'm sure. Derek placed the ring on the stone balustrade between us, the metal making a small clicking sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Inside the ballroom, the band began playing Moon River, Natalie's favorite song, and the irony of the romantic melody underscoring this moment of destruction wasn't lost on me. I'll stay at the Marriott tonight, Derek continued, his voice becoming more businesslike, as if we were negotiating a corporate contract rather than ending a marriage. We can discuss details when you're ready. The house, the accounts, custody arrangements for when we visit Natalie and Connor. Custody arrangements, I repeated numbly. They're adults, Derek. You know what I mean. Holiday schedules, family events. We'll need to coordinate so things don't become awkward for them. The casual way he discussed dismantling our life together, as if it were simply a matter of efficient planning, sparked something fierce and protective in my chest. This man who'd shared my bed for over 2 decades, who'd held my hand during my father's funeral, and celebrated with me when Natalie graduated summa cum laude, was reducing our entire relationship to a logistics problem to be solved. Get out, I said quietly. Vanessa, I know you're upset, but we need to be practical about, get out. The words exploded from me with enough force that several guests on the terrace turned to stare. Get out of here right now, before I tell our daughter exactly what kind of man her father really is. Derek's face flushed, but whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm trying to handle this with dignity. Dignity? I laughed, the sound harsh and broken. You think abandoning your wife at your daughter's wedding shows dignity? You think parading your mistress around our family celebration demonstrates class? Lower your voice, Derek hissed, glancing nervously toward the ballroom windows. People will hear. Let them hear, I said, my voice carrying across the terrace with crystalline clarity. Let everyone know that Derek Hartwell is the kind of man who waits until his daughter's wedding day to destroy his family. For a moment, Derek looked genuinely stricken, as if he'd finally grasped the magnitude of his choice and its timing. But then his expression hardened into the corporate mask I'd learned to recognize during our marriage counseling sessions, when he'd felt cornered by emotions he couldn't control or compartmentalize. I'll send someone for my things next week, he said stiffly, straightening his tie with the same gesture he used before important business meetings. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce papers. He walked away without looking back, his stride confident and purposeful, as if he were heading to a boardroom rather than abandoning the life we'd built together. I watched him disappear around the corner of the building, presumably to collect Claudia, and begin whatever adventure they'd planned together. I stood alone on the terrace for several minutes, my mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Through the ballroom windows, I could see Natalie dancing with Connor, her face radiant with happiness as she laughed at something he whispered in her ear. The sight of her joy, so pure and uncomplicated, gave me the strength to arrange my face into something resembling composure before rejoining the celebration. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of practiced social behavior. I smiled at the appropriate moments, accepted compliments about the beautiful wedding, and helped coordinate the departure logistics for Natalie and Connor's honeymoon send-off. Patricia stayed close, her protective presence preventing anyone from noticing that my responses had become mechanical, and my smiles never quite reached my eyes. When Natalie hugged me goodbye before leaving for her honeymoon suite, she pulled back to study my face with concern. Mom, are you okay? You look pale. Just tired, sweetheart, I managed, smoothing her hair one last time. It's been a long, emotional day. Thank you for making everything so perfect, she whispered, tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. This was exactly the wedding I dreamed of. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her perfume, and trying to memorize the feeling of her in my arms, still believing that her parents were happily married, and that love could conquer any obstacle. Tomorrow she would begin her honeymoon, and by the time she returned, her entire understanding of our family would be shattered. I love you, Natalie, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside my chest. Have the most wonderful time in Italy. As Connor helped her into their decorated car amid a shower of rose petals and well wishes, I caught sight of Derek's empty parking space and felt the full weight of my new reality settling onto my shoulders. In a matter of hours, I'd gone from being half of a couple to standing completely alone, watching my daughter drive away into her future, while my own future stretched ahead like in vast unmarked territory. The last guests departed around midnight, leaving me alone with the catering staff and wedding vendors who efficiently dismantled the celebration. Helen Nakamura handled most of the coordination, allowing me to retreat to a quiet corner of the ballroom, where I sat surrounded by the remnants of what had been a perfect day. Centerpieces waited to be distributed to guests who'd requested them, leftover cake sat ready for donation to the local shelter, and scattered rose petals marked the spots where people had danced and laughed and celebrated love's promise. My marriage was over, I realized with startling clarity. Not because of Derek's affair, or even his departure, but because I'd finally seen our relationship for what it had actually become, a business partnership disguised as a romance. Two people who'd forgotten how to be genuinely intimate while maintaining the appearance of domestic success. What I didn't know yet was that Derek's betrayal would become the catalyst for discovering strengths I never knew I possessed, for building a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced during our years of comfortable compromise. His abandonment would force me to confront questions I'd been avoiding about my own dreams and desires, leading me down paths I would never have explored while safely ensconced in our predictable routine. But that transformation lay months in the future. On this night, I simply sat in the empty ballroom where my daughter had married her true love, surrounded by the beautiful remnants of a perfect wedding, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would look like in a world where I was no longer Derek Hartwell's wife. The morning after Natalie's wedding arrived with the kind of cruel brightness that makes personal devastation feel like a cosmic joke. Sunlight streamed through the windows of our riverside home, illuminating the scattered remnants of celebration, corsages wilting on the kitchen counter, gift bags from out-of-town guests abandoned on the foyer table, and my midnight blue dress draped over the bedroom chair like a discarded costume from a play that had ended badly. I sat at the kitchen table still wearing the slip I'd fallen asleep in, staring at Derek's coffee mug in the dish drainer. The ceramic bore the logo of his golf club, a Father's Day gift from Natalie 3 years ago that had become part of his morning routine. Its presence felt accusatory, a reminder of the thousands of ordinary moments that had comprised our marriage, now revealed as an elaborate performance with an audience of one. Patricia had stayed overnight, sleeping in the guest room after insisting she wouldn't leave me alone on my first night as an abandoned wife. Her maternal instincts had kicked into overdrive the moment Derek walked away, and she'd spent the drive home from Willowbrook making phone calls to her husband and arranging to extend her stay indefinitely. The sound of her moving around upstairs offered some comfort, proof that I wasn't completely alone in this house that suddenly felt cavernous and foreign. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart lurched with the irrational hope that Derek had come to his senses overnight. Instead, the message came from Helen Nakamura, efficiently handling post-wedding logistics with her characteristic attention to detail. The florist wanted to know about pickup arrangements for the centerpieces, the photographer needed to confirm delivery preferences for the wedding album, and the caterers had questions about the final headcount for billing purposes. Each message felt like a small knife twist, reminders that the business of celebration continued even after the celebration itself had been poisoned by betrayal. I found myself unable to respond to any of them, paralyzed by the gap between the joyful assumptions underlying their questions and the devastating reality of my situation. How do you explain to a wedding photographer that the marriage they documented was already over before the reception ended? Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing one of my robes, her graying hair tucked behind her ears, and her face creased with concern. She'd always been the practical one in our family, the sister who solved problems through action rather than analysis, and I could see her mentally cataloging the tasks that would need immediate attention. "Coffee's ready," she announced, pouring herself a mug and settling into the chair across from me. "And I've been thinking about priorities. First thing we need to do is contact a lawyer. Someone who specializes in divorce cases involving significant assets." The word divorce hit me with unexpected force, even though Derek had mentioned it explicitly the night before. Hearing Patricia say it aloud made the situation feel permanent in a way that his departure had not. Until that moment, some part of me had been clinging to the possibility that this was an elaborate midlife crisis that would resolve itself once Derek came to his senses. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice hoarse from the crying I'd done after Patricia had finally convinced me to go to bed. I haven't had to think about lawyers or finances or any of this in decades. Derek handled everything. Patricia's expression darkened at this admission. She'd never entirely approved of my decision to step back from my event planning career after Natalie was born, though she'd been diplomatic enough to keep most of her opinions to herself over the years. Now her disapproval felt less like criticism and more like prescient concern for exactly this type of situation. "That's going to change starting today," she said firmly. "We're going to get you set up with your own bank account, your own credit cards, your own everything. No more depending on someone else for access to your own life." The next several hours passed in a blur of phone calls and administrative tasks. Patricia proved invaluable as both emotional support and practical coordinator, handling the conversations I felt too fragmented to manage myself. She contacted our family attorney, who specialized in estate planning rather than divorce, but could provide referrals to appropriate specialists. She called our bank to inquire about procedures for separating joint accounts. She even contacted a locksmith to change the house locks, a precaution that felt both necessary and surreal. By mid-afternoon, I'd managed to shower and dress in actual clothes, though the simple act of choosing an outfit felt overwhelming when my entire identity as Derek's wife had been stripped away overnight. I settled on jeans and a sweater, clothes that felt anonymous and safe, unlike the carefully curated wardrobe I'd maintained for corporate events and social functions. The doorbell rang while Patricia was on hold with our insurance company, trying to understand how Derek's departure would affect our coverage. I answered to find Helen Nakamura standing on the front step, her usually impeccable composure showing signs of strain. She held a large manila envelope and wore the expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Vanessa, I'm so sorry to bother you," she began, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "But I received a call this morning that I think you need to know about." My stomach clenched with anticipation of yet another blow. "What kind of call?" "From Derek's credit card company. Apparently there's been some unusual activity on the account used for wedding expenses. Large charges in California that seem unrelated to the event itself." Helen's discomfort was obvious as she handed me the envelope. "I thought you should see the statements before anyone else does." Inside the envelope, I found credit card statements showing charges that painted a clear picture of Derek's deception. Hotel reservations in San Francisco, extending back 3 months. Expensive restaurant bills for 2. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany that I'd never received. Most damning of all, charges for a luxury resort in Napa Valley with checkout dates that coincided exactly with business trips Derek had supposedly taken alone. The financial evidence of his affair felt more devastating than witnessing his departure, concrete proof that his betrayal hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated campaign of deception stretching back months. Every late night at the office and weekend conference had been lies funded by our joint accounts while I'd remained obliviously supportive of his demanding schedule. "There's more," Helen continued reluctantly. "The final payment for the wedding reception was declined this morning. The account apparently doesn't have sufficient funds to cover the remaining balance." This revelation hit me like ice water. Derek had assured me repeatedly that wedding finances were well in hand, that the costs were manageable within our family budget. The possibility that he'd deliberately sabotaged our accounts as part of his exit strategy hadn't occurred to me, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Patricia appeared behind me, instantly reading the situation from my expression and Helen's obvious discomfort. She took the statements from my trembling hands and scanned them quickly, her face growing progressively more furious as she absorbed the details. That bastard, she muttered, her language unusually strong for someone who'd been raised in our mother's genteel household. He's been planning this for months, hasn't he? The affair, the departure, even the financial sabotage. Helen nodded reluctantly. I'm afraid it appears that way. Vanessa, I hate to add pressure, but the caterers and florists are expecting payment within the week. If the accounts have been drained, we need to explore alternative options quickly. The conversation that followed felt like negotiating in a foreign language. Helen mentioned payment plans and credit extensions while Patricia discussed liquid assets and emergency funds, but their words seemed to come from a great distance. I'd spent 23 years trusting Derek to handle our financial planning, and now I was discovering that trust had been not just misplaced but actively exploited. After Helen left with promises to buy us additional time with the vendors, Patricia sat me down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began what she called a reality assessment. Together we attempted to piece together a picture of my actual financial situation, separate from Derek's manipulations. The exercise proved both enlightening and terrifying. I had access to our joint checking account, but the balance was significantly lower than I'd expected based on Derek's previous assurances about our financial health. Our joint savings account, which I'd assumed contained enough for emergencies and retirement planning, showed a pattern of large withdrawals over the past 6 months that I couldn't account for. More troubling still, I discovered that Derek had removed my name from several investment accounts without my knowledge, a revelation that came to light when Patricia insisted on calling our financial advisor directly. The man seemed genuinely surprised to learn that I was unaware of the changes, explaining that Derek had presented the modifications as part of a tax planning strategy that would benefit both of us. I don't understand, I said, staring at the notes Patricia had compiled. How is any of this legal? How can someone just remove their spouse from accounts without permission? Unfortunately, with joint accounts and shared financial advisors, there are a lot of ways for one person to manipulate the system. Patricia explained grimly. Especially when that person has been handling all the financial decisions for decades. This is exactly why I've always insisted on maintaining some independence, even in marriage. The criticism stung because it was entirely accurate. I'd allowed myself to become financially dependent in the name of marital harmony, trusting Derek to act in our mutual best interests, while remaining willfully ignorant of the details that would have protected me. Now that trust had been weaponized against me, leaving me vulnerable in ways I was only beginning to understand. That evening, Patricia convinced me to venture out for dinner at a quiet restaurant in downtown Riverside. The change of scenery was supposed to help clear my head, but being in public felt overwhelming. Every couple I saw reminded me of my new status as a woman dining alone, and every happy family sparked fresh anger about Derek's selfishness in choosing our daughter's wedding day for his dramatic exit. We were sharing a bottle of wine and picking at our entrees when I spotted a familiar face across the restaurant. Margaret O'Brien sat at a corner table with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them engaged in animated conversation over what appeared to be business documents. Margaret owned Harvest Moon Catering, a farm-to-table company that had handled several charity events I'd helped organize before stepping back from professional work. "Isn't that Maggie O'Brien?" Patricia asked, following my gaze. "Didn't you work with her on some events?" I nodded, remembering the collaborative relationship we developed during my active years in event planning. Margaret had always impressed me with her combination of culinary creativity and business acumen, building her company from a small operation working out of her home kitchen into one of the most sought-after catering services in Fairfield County. As if sensing my attention, Margaret looked up and recognized me despite my obvious distress. She excused herself from her companion and approached our table with the warm smile that had made her so successful in the hospitality industry. "Vanessa, what a lovely surprise," she said, then paused as she registered my expression. "Although you look like you've been through quite an ordeal. Is everything all right?" The kindness in her voice threatened to undo the fragile composure I'd maintained throughout dinner. "Not really," I managed. "But thank you for asking." Margaret glanced uncertainly between Patricia and me, clearly sensing that something significant had occurred but unsure whether to inquire further. Patricia, ever the protective sister, stepped in to provide a diplomatically edited explanation. "Vanessa's going through a difficult divorce," she said simply. "We're just trying to work through some of the immediate logistics." "Oh my dear," Margaret said, her expression shifting to genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry to hear that." Divorce is never easy, but it can also be the beginning of something better, if you're open to the possibility. Something in her tone caught my attention, a suggestion that she spoke from personal experience rather than just social politeness. You sound like you know something about new beginnings, I said. Margaret's smile became more genuine, less automatically professional. I do indeed. My own divorce 15 years ago felt like the end of the world at the time, but it turned out to be exactly the push I needed to start this business. Sometimes we need our old life to completely fall apart before we can build something better. She handed me her business card, though I already had several from our previous professional interactions. If you ever want to talk about starting over, call me. I'm serious about that offer. There's something liberating about building something that belongs entirely to you. After Margaret returned to her table, Patricia and I sat in thoughtful silence. The idea of starting over professionally hadn't occurred to me in concrete terms yet, though I'd begun to realize that my old life was irretrievably gone. Derek's betrayal had demolished not just our marriage, but my entire social identity as his wife, leaving me free to rebuild according to my own priorities for the first time in decades. She's right, you know, Patricia said finally. About this being an opportunity. You were brilliant at event planning before you gave it up. There's no reason you couldn't do it again, or try something completely different. The possibility felt both exciting and terrifying. I'd spent so many years defining myself through Derek's achievements and Natalie's needs, that I'd almost forgotten I'd once had professional ambitions of my own. The woman who'd coordinated corporate retreats and charity galas felt like someone from another lifetime, but maybe she was still accessible if I had the courage to look for her. Over the following days, I began the slow process of disentangling my life from Derek's while simultaneously trying to understand what I wanted my future to look like. The legal consultation Patricia had arranged proved both enlightening and depressing, confirming that Derek's financial manipulations would significantly complicate the divorce proceedings. The attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Mills who specialized in high-asset divorces, explained that Derek's systematic removal of my access to accounts and investments suggested premeditation that would work in my favor during settlement negotiations. However, recovering assets that had already been spent or transferred would be complicated and expensive. The good news is that Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, Catherine explained during our initial meeting. That means marital assets should be divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but based on factors like contribution to the marriage and future earning capacity. The bad news is that your husband appears to have been planning this departure for some time, which means he's had months to position assets advantageously. The legal complexities felt overwhelming, but Catherine's confidence provided some reassurance that I wouldn't be left completely destitute. More importantly, her matter-of-fact approach to what felt like a personal catastrophe helped me begin thinking about the divorce as a business transaction rather than an emotional devastation. Meanwhile, the social aftermath of Derek's departure began manifesting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word of our separation spread through our social circle with the inevitable efficiency of small-town gossip, generating a steady stream of phone calls and visits from well-meaning friends who didn't know quite what to say. Some conversations felt genuinely supportive, like the one with my neighbor Claire, who brought homemade soup and shared her own story of rebuilding after her husband's death 5 years earlier. Others felt more like social reconnaissance missions, thinly veiled attempts to gather details about the scandal that had apparently become a topic of considerable interest among our acquaintances. The most difficult calls came from Natalie, who was trying to enjoy her honeymoon in Italy while processing the news that her parents' marriage had imploded during her wedding reception. Derek had apparently called her during their second day in Rome, presenting his own version of events that painted his departure as a mutual decision reached after months of discussion. "Mom, I don't understand," Natalie said during a crackling international phone call, her voice small and confused. "Dad says you two have been unhappy for years, and that this is better for everyone. But you never said anything about problems. You seemed fine at the wedding. How do you explain to your daughter that her father abandoned the family on her wedding day without destroying her faith in love and marriage entirely? How do you balance honesty about his betrayal with protecting her relationship with her father?" I found myself walking a diplomatic tightrope, trying to acknowledge the reality of our situation without burdening her with details that would poison her memories of what should have been the happiest day of her life. "Sometimes marriages end even when both people aren't bad people," I said carefully. "Your father and I want different things for our futures, and we decided it was better to be honest about that than to pretend everything was fine." It wasn't entirely true, of course. Derek had made the decision unilaterally, and his timing had been deliberately cruel. But protecting Natalie's emotional well-being felt more important than ensuring she understood the complete truth about her father's character flaws. 2 weeks after Derek's departure, I received an unexpected visitor that would prove pivotal to my eventual transformation. Margaret O'Brien appeared at my front door on a crisp November morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression of someone on a mission. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit," she said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs Patricia had vacated an hour earlier for her return trip to Boston. "But I've been thinking about our conversation at the restaurant, and I have a proposition for you." Margaret explained that her catering business had grown beyond her capacity to handle personally, particularly during the busy holiday season. She needed someone with event planning experience to help coordinate client relationships and manage logistics for larger functions. The position would be part-time initially, allowing me to ease back into professional work while dealing with divorce proceedings. "I know you're probably not thinking about work right now," she continued, "but I remember how talented you were at managing complex events. And honestly, I think you might benefit from having something productive to focus on while everything else gets sorted out." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in uncertainty. The prospect of having somewhere to go each day, of contributing to something meaningful rather than just surviving from one lawyer's meeting to the next, appealed to me more than I'd expected. "I haven't worked in over 15 years, I said hesitantly. "The industry has probably changed completely since I was active." "Some things have changed," Margaret acknowledged. "But the fundamentals are the same. People still want beautiful events that run smoothly, and you still have the skills to make that happen. Everything else we can figure out together." That afternoon, I drove to Harvest Moon's headquarters in a converted barn outside of town, curious to see what Margaret had built since our last professional interaction. The operation impressed me immediately with its combination of rustic charm and modern efficiency. The main kitchen buzzed with activity as staff prepared for that evening's events, while the adjacent office space managed logistics with the kind of organized chaos I remembered from my own event planning days. Margaret introduced me to her team with obvious pride, explaining my background and the consulting role she'd proposed. The staff welcomed me warmly, and I found myself drawn into conversations about upcoming events and client challenges that felt both familiar and energizing. "We have a corporate holiday party next month that's going to be our biggest event of the year," explained Sarah, Margaret's current operations manager. 200 guests, full dinner service, live entertainment, and the client keeps changing requirements. "We could really use someone with your experience to help manage the moving pieces." As Sarah described the event details, I felt something awakening that had been dormant for years. The complex logistics puzzle of coordinating multiple vendors, managing client expectations, and ensuring flawless execution had once been my specialty. The challenge excited me in a way that surprised me, given everything else happening in my life. "When would you need me to start?" I asked Margaret as we concluded the facility tour. "As soon as you're ready," she replied. "Even a few hours a week would be helpful, and we can build from there based on what works for your schedule." Driving home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Derek's departure: anticipation for the future. The prospect of rebuilding my professional identity felt both daunting and exhilarating, a chance to rediscover capabilities I'd set aside for so long that I'd begun to doubt they still existed. That night, I called Patricia to share news of Margaret's offer and my decision to accept it. Her enthusiasm was immediate and infectious, reflecting her belief that professional independence would be crucial to my long-term recovery from Derek's betrayal. "This is exactly what you need," she said emphatically. "Something that's yours, that he can't take away or diminish. I'm so proud of you for being brave enough to try." The next morning, I began what would prove to be the most challenging and rewarding chapter of my adult life. Margaret had been right about the benefits of having productive work to focus on, but she'd underestimated how much I would discover about my own capabilities when given the chance to develop them without limitation or compromise. Working at Harvest Moon felt like awakening from a long sleep, gradually remembering skills and instincts that had been buried under years of domestic routine. More importantly, it provided daily proof that I could succeed independently, that my value wasn't dependent on my relationship to Derek or anyone else. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and there would be setbacks and moments of doubt along the way. But standing in Margaret's kitchen on that first morning, reviewing vendor contracts and discussing menu modifications, I felt the first stirrings of the woman I would eventually become: stronger, more confident, and infinitely more authentic than the one Derek had abandoned at Natalie's wedding. 3 months into my new role at Harvest Moon Catering, I stood in the converted barn kitchen at 5 in the morning, my hands deep in bread dough while Margaret demonstrated the technique for achieving the perfect crust on her signature rosemary focaccia. The early hour no longer felt punishing as it had during my first weeks. Instead, these quiet morning sessions had become a form of meditation, a peaceful transition from sleep to the controlled chaos of event preparation. My transformation from reluctant part-time consultant to invested team member had surprised everyone, including myself. What had begun as therapeutic distraction from divorce proceedings had evolved into genuine passion for the intricate dance of professional catering. Margaret had been wise enough to let my involvement grow organically, never pushing but always making space for increased responsibility when I showed readiness to accept it. Feel how the dough responds, Margaret instructed, her experienced hands shaping the risen mixture with practiced efficiency. It should be smooth and elastic, with just enough resistance to hold its shape but not so tight that it fights you. Like working with people, really. You need to understand what each element can handle before you ask it to perform. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. In the months since Derek's departure, I'd been learning my own capacity for resilience, discovering strengths that had remained dormant during years of comfortable dependency. Each successful event, each crisis averted through quick thinking and creative problem solving, had built my confidence incrementally until I'd begun to recognize the competent professional I'd once been. The corporate holiday party that Sarah had mentioned during my first visit had become a defining moment in my professional resurrection. The client, a pharmaceutical company celebrating their most profitable year in decades, had requested an elegant cocktail reception for 200 executives and their spouses. Simple enough in concept, but complicated by the CEO's wife, who treated event planning like a competitive sport and seemed determined to change every detail at least twice. I'd been assigned to manage client communications, a role that required diplomatic translation between the woman's increasingly elaborate visions and Margaret's practical limitations. The experience had tested every interpersonal skill I'd developed during my original career, but succeeding in that challenge had proved to myself that I could handle difficult personalities without Derek's protection or intervention. Mrs. Hamilton wants to add ice sculptures now, I'd reported to Margaret during one of our planning meetings. Specifically, she wants replicas of the company's molecular structures rendered in frozen artistry. For a cocktail party. In December. In Connecticut, Margaret had simply raised an eyebrow and waited for my solution, a technique that had become her preferred method of developing my problem-solving abilities. Over the weeks, I'd learned to anticipate her expectation that I would present options rather than just problems. I found a sculptor in Hartford who specializes in scientific imagery. I'd continued. He can create smaller pieces that will be striking but manageable, and I've arranged for specialized lighting that will make them the focal point of the cocktail area. Mrs. Hamilton gets her dramatic effect, we avoid logistical nightmares, and the pieces will actually enhance the evening rather than overshadowing it. The party had been a tremendous success, generating 3 immediate bookings from impressed guests and earning me recognition as someone who could manage high-maintenance clients while protecting both the company's reputation and Margaret's sanity. More importantly, it had given me concrete proof that my skills were not only intact, but had actually improved through the confidence that comes from operating independently. As winter settled over Connecticut, my responsibilities at Harvest Moon continued expanding. Margaret had begun including me in vendor negotiations, recognizing that my fresh perspective often identified cost savings or quality improvements that her established relationships had overlooked. I'd also taken over much of the initial client consultation process, discovering that my own recent experience with life transitions made me particularly effective at understanding what people really wanted from their events. There's something about you that makes people feel safe telling the truth, Margaret observed after I'd successfully talked a bride out of an elaborate ceremony that would have been beautiful but completely wrong for her personality. You listen to what they're not saying as much as what they are saying. That's a rare gift in this business. The insight surprised me because I'd never considered empathy a professional skill. During my marriage to Derek, emotional intelligence had felt more like a survival mechanism, a way to anticipate and navigate his moods and expectations. Discovering that this sensitivity could be an asset rather than a burden marked another step in reclaiming aspects of myself that I'd begun to see as weaknesses. My personal life had also begun stabilizing, though in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the woman I'd been a year earlier. The divorce proceedings had settled into a predictable rhythm of mediation sessions and document exchanges, with Catherine Mills proving as fierce an advocate as I could have hoped. Derek's financial manipulations had been largely unraveled, resulting in a settlement that would allow me to keep the house and maintain financial independence. More significantly, I'd stopped hoping for reconciliation. The anger that had sustained me through the initial months of abandonment had gradually been replaced by something closer to relief. Living alone had revealed how much energy I'd been expending on managing Derek's expectations and maintaining his vision of our perfect life. Without that constant background pressure, I'd rediscovered interests and opinions that had been submerged for years. I'd started reading voraciously again, working through a stack of novels that had been accumulating on my nightstand throughout my marriage. I'd begun experimenting with recipes that Derek wouldn't have appreciated, discovering a love for spicy foods and exotic flavors that his conservative palate had never encouraged. Most surprisingly, I'd started taking evening walks through Riverside's historic district, appreciating architectural details and seasonal changes that I'd been too busy or distracted to notice during years of driving past them. The social isolation that had initially felt like punishment had transformed into welcome solitude. Friends who'd remained loyal after choosing sides in the divorce had learned to respect my need for space, while those who'd aligned themselves with Derek had revealed their true priorities in ways that made their absence feel like liberation rather than loss. Natalie's return from her honeymoon had required delicate navigation of our new family dynamics. She'd been understandably confused and hurt by her parents' separation, struggling to reconcile the stable marriage she'd believed in with the reality of our incompatibility. Derek had maintained his version of events, presenting their divorce as a mutual decision reached through mature communication rather than acknowledging his betrayal and abandonment. I'd chosen not to contradict his narrative directly, focusing instead on rebuilding my relationship with Natalie based on who I was becoming rather than defending who I'd been. Our conversations had grown more honest and substantial as I'd stopped filtering my opinions through concerns about Derek's approval. Natalie had begun to see me as an individual, rather than just her mother, and she'd expressed surprise at aspects of my personality that had apparently been invisible during her childhood. "I never knew you were funny," she'd said during one of our weekly dinners together. "I mean, I knew you could be amusing at parties and things, but you have this whole sarcastic side that I never noticed before." The observation had been both gratifying and sobering, confirmation that I'd suppressed significant parts of my authentic self in service of maintaining family harmony. Derek had never appreciated humor that carried any edge or challenged conventional thinking, so I'd learned to modulate my responses to avoid conflict. Discovering that my own daughter hadn't known this aspect of my personality highlighted how thoroughly I'd edited myself over the years. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a surge of bookings that pushed Harvest Moon to capacity and forced Margaret to make decisions about expansion. The success had created what she called good problems, challenges that arose from abundance rather than scarcity, but still required careful management to maintain quality standards. "I've been thinking about bringing you on as a full partner," Margaret announced during one of our early morning prep sessions. "Not just because I need the help, though I definitely do, but because you bring something to this business that I can't replicate on my own." The offer caught me completely off guard, though I realized it shouldn't have. My contributions had become integral to Harvest Moon's operations, and my client relationships had generated significant revenue. More than that, I'd fallen genuinely in love with the work itself, finding satisfaction in the combination of creativity, logistics, and human psychology that successful event planning required. "I don't have the capital for a partnership investment," I said honestly, thinking of the financial constraints that still governed my post-divorce budget. "I'm not talking about buying in," Margaret clarified. "I'm talking about earning equity through sweat and expertise. You've already proved your value to this company. What I'm proposing is formalizing that contribution with actual ownership stake." The conversation that followed stretched over several weeks as we worked with attorneys to structure an arrangement that protected both our interests while acknowledging the reality of my growing importance to the business. Margaret's generosity overwhelmed me, but she insisted that practical considerations drove her decision as much as friendship. "You're not the same person who walked into my kitchen 6 months ago," she pointed out during one of our planning discussions. "That woman was broken and scared and looking for somewhere to hide while she healed. This woman sitting across from me is a force of nature who happens to be exactly what Harvest Moon needs to reach the next level." Her confidence in my abilities exceeded my own, but I'd learned to trust Margaret's judgment about business matters. More importantly, accepting her offer would represent a complete break from the financial dependence that had made Derek's betrayal so devastating. Having my name on ownership documents, contributing to strategic decisions, building something that belonged to me would provide security that no marriage could guarantee. The partnership agreement was finalized on a brilliant April morning, with both of us signing documents in Margaret's office while Sarah popped champagne and the kitchen staff cheered from the adjacent room. I'd brought Natalie and Connor to witness the signing, wanting to share this milestone with family who could appreciate its significance. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Natalie said as we walked through the renovated barn afterward, her voice carrying an emotion I hadn't heard since her wedding day. "Not just for the business success, but for becoming this person. You seem so much stronger and more confident than I remember." Her words meant more to me than any professional recognition could have, confirmation that my transformation had been visible to those who knew me best. The shy, accommodating woman who'd spent decades managing Derek's image and expectations had been replaced by someone willing to take risks and accept responsibility for her own choices. Summer brought challenges that tested our partnership in unexpected ways. A major client defaulted on payment after their event, leaving us temporarily cash poor despite having delivered exceptional service. A key vendor doubled their prices with minimal notice, forcing us to renegotiate contracts and adjust our pricing structure. Most dramatically, a kitchen fire caused by a malfunctioning oven shut down our primary workspace for 3 weeks during peak wedding season. Each crisis had demanded creative solutions and collaborative problem solving that strengthened both our business relationship and personal friendship. Margaret's experience provided strategic guidance, while my fresh perspective often identified alternatives that conventional thinking had missed. Together, we'd navigated obstacles that might have destroyed a less cohesive partnership. The kitchen fire had been particularly challenging because it occurred just 2 weeks before the largest wedding of our season, a 3-day celebration for a family that had booked us a year in advance. Relocating our operations to a rented commercial kitchen while coordinating repairs had required the kind of complex logistics management that I'd become passionate about solving. "This is actually exciting," I told Margaret as we surveyed the temporary workspace we'd arranged in a restaurant that was closed for renovations. "It's like a puzzle where all the pieces keep changing shape, but somehow we're going to make them fit together perfectly." Her laughter had carried relief as much as amusement. "Only you would describe potential financial ruin as exciting. But you're right, if we can pull this off, we can handle anything." We had pulled it off, delivering an event that exceeded the client's expectations despite operating under conditions that would have justified significant compromises. The experience had proved our resilience and adaptability, generating referrals that more than compensated for the temporary disruption. By autumn, Harvest Moon had established itself as one of the premier catering companies in Fairfield County, with a reputation for handling complex events with grace and creativity. My own reputation within the industry had grown alongside the business, earning recognition from colleagues who'd begun seeking my advice on challenging clients and unusual requests. "You've become the person everyone wants to work with," Sarah observed during one of our weekly planning meetings. "Vendors tell me you're fair but demanding. Clients say you understand what they need even when they can't articulate it themselves. And other planners ask if we're hiring because they want to learn from you." The professional recognition felt surreal given how recently I'd considered myself unemployable after decades away from the workforce. More meaningful was the personal satisfaction that came from solving problems and creating beauty through collaborative effort. Each successful event represented hours of planning and coordination, but also the fulfillment of helping people celebrate life's most important moments. The approach of Natalie and Connor's first wedding anniversary had created an unexpected emotional challenge. They'd planned a small celebration dinner for family and close friends, a gathering that would inevitably include Derek and force our first social interaction since his departure. The prospect of seeing him again, particularly in a context that would remind everyone of his wedding day betrayal, had stirred anxieties I'd thought I'd resolved. "You don't have to attend if it's too difficult," Natalie had offered when she'd first mentioned the anniversary plans. "Connor and I would understand if you need to protect yourself from that situation." Her thoughtfulness touched me, but the suggestion also sparked something defensive and proud. Why should I avoid celebrating my daughter's happiness because Derek had chosen to destroy our marriage? Why should his presence limit my participation in family events that had nothing to do with our failed relationship? "I'll be there," I told her firmly. "Your marriage deserves to be celebrated, and I deserve to be part of that celebration. Your father's choices don't get to determine where I'm welcome in my own family." The decision had required weeks of emotional preparation and practical planning. I'd arranged for Margaret to handle any catering emergencies that might arise during the dinner, ensuring that I could focus entirely on family rather than work obligations. I'd also spent considerable time with my therapist, whom I'd started seeing during the divorce proceedings, exploring strategies for maintaining emotional equilibrium during what would inevitably be a charged interaction. Most importantly, I'd begun planning what would become my moment of triumph, though I hadn't yet recognized it as such. Natalie had asked if I'd be willing to offer a toast during dinner, a request that had initially filled me with dread, but gradually transformed into an opportunity for something more significant than simple well wishes. The toast I would eventually deliver would become legendary among those present, a perfectly crafted blend of grace and subtle devastation that would leave Derek speechless while celebrating everything beautiful about Natalie and Connor's relationship. But the woman who would stand before that gathering with such confidence and eloquence was still emerging, still discovering the power that came from absolute authenticity combined with hard-won wisdom. As the anniversary dinner approached, I found myself feeling not anxiety but anticipation. Derek would see the woman he'd abandoned, transformed by necessity and choice into someone far more formidable than the dependent wife he'd left behind. The comparison would be inevitable, and I suspected deeply uncomfortable for someone who justified his betrayal by characterizing our marriage as mutually unsatisfying. More than revenge, though, I looked forward to the opportunity to publicly celebrate my daughter's happiness while demonstrating that Derek's cruelty had ultimately been a gift, freeing me to become someone I could never have been while bound by his limitations and expectations. The toast would be my declaration of independence, delivered with the kind of devastating grace that only comes from having survived the worst someone can do to you, and emerged stronger for the experience. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that announced Natalie and Connor's first anniversary celebration with elegant simplicity. Reading my daughter's handwriting across the formal invitation felt surreal, a reminder that she'd transitioned fully into adult social rituals that included hosting dinner parties for both sides of her now complicated family tree. The guest list, as Natalie had carefully explained during our weekly lunch, would include Connor's parents, his sister and brother-in-law, Derek with Claudia and me. 8 people gathered around a table where the elephant in the room would be the spectacular failure of the marriage that had produced half the attendees. The symmetry felt almost deliberately cruel, though I knew Natalie's intentions were nothing but hopeful. "I just want everyone I love to be able to celebrate together," she'd said, her voice carrying the slight pleading tone she'd used as a child when asking for something she knew might be difficult. "Connor and I are so happy, and I want to share that happiness with our families, even if our families are more complicated now than they used to be." Her optimism was both touching and naive, reflecting the kind of faith in human decency that successful marriages can foster. Natalie genuinely believed that shared love for her and Connor could overcome the awkwardness of Derek's betrayal and abandonment, that good intentions and excellent wine could smooth over the fundamental character differences that had destroyed our marriage. I'd agreed to attend not because I shared her optimism, but because I'd finally reached a point where Derek's presence couldn't diminish my sense of self-worth. The woman who'd been abandoned at her daughter's wedding might have declined such an invitation, too wounded and uncertain to risk public humiliation. The woman I'd become through 18 months of deliberate reconstruction looked forward to the encounter as an opportunity to demonstrate just how thoroughly I'd moved beyond his capacity to hurt me. The week leading up to the dinner had been particularly intense at Harvest Moon, with 3 major events requiring simultaneous coordination and a new client whose demands exceeded even Mrs. Hamilton's legendary perfectionism. Margaret had insisted I take the anniversary evening completely off, arranging coverage that would allow me to focus entirely on family obligations without worrying about professional emergencies. "This is your night to shine," she'd said, while reviewing our staffing arrangements. "Derek hasn't seen you since you were broken and desperate. Now he gets to meet the woman who's built something magnificent from the ashes of his betrayal. I almost feel sorry for him." Her confidence in my transformation exceeded my own, though I'd begun to recognize truth in her assessment. The reflection that met me in mirrors now belonged to someone I genuinely liked and respected, someone whose opinions mattered and whose achievements were earned rather than inherited through marriage. Derek would indeed be meeting a stranger, though one who happened to inhabit the body of his former wife. Choosing what to wear for the anniversary dinner required more consideration than I'd given to any outfit since Derek's departure. The selection needed to communicate several messages simultaneously: success without ostentation, confidence without aggression, and complete indifference to his approval or disapproval. After trying on and rejecting dozens of options, I'd finally settled on a black silk dress that Margaret had helped me select for a particularly important client presentation. The dress was sophisticated without being showy, professional without being cold, and fit my transformed body in ways that suggested health and vitality rather than deliberate seduction. Paired with the pearl necklace Derek had given me for our 10th anniversary, the ensemble felt like exactly the right combination of honoring our shared history while making clear that I'd moved far beyond it. Natalie and Connor had chosen the Copper Beech Inn for their celebration, a historic restaurant in nearby Ivoryton that specialized in intimate dining experiences. The venue's reputation for exceptional cuisine and discreet service made it a favorite among couples celebrating significant milestones, though I suspected my daughter had also chosen it for the neutral territory it provided. I arrived precisely on time, a habit of punctuality that professional catering had reinforced after years of Derek's casual relationship with schedules. The hostess led me through the elegant dining room to a private alcove where Natalie waited with Connor and his family, their animated conversation suggesting they'd been there long enough to settle into comfortable socializing. "Mom, you look absolutely radiant," Natalie said, rising to embrace me with genuine warmth. "I love that dress on you. Is it new?" "New to you," I replied, accepting hugs from Connor and his parents, while noting the empty chairs that would presumably be occupied by Derek and Claudia. "Margaret helped me choose it for a client presentation last month. Apparently it photographs well, which is important when you're trying to convince people to trust you with their most important events." The casual reference to my professional life wasn't accidental. I'd learned to weave mentions of my work into conversations naturally, establishing my identity as a successful businesswoman rather than simply Derek's ex-wife. Connor's mother, a sophisticated woman who'd built her own career in interior design, immediately responded with interested questions about the catering industry. "How fascinating that you've moved into event planning," she said, her tone suggesting genuine rather than polite interest. "Connor mentioned that you've become quite successful. It must be incredibly satisfying to build something entirely your own." The conversation that followed allowed me to describe Harvest Moon's growth and my role in our expansion plans, topics that engaged everyone at the table and established me as someone with current achievements rather than just historical connections. By the time Derek and Claudia arrived 20 minutes later, I was comfortably settled into the evening's social dynamic. Derek's entrance created a momentary pause in conversation, the kind of subtle tension that occurs when someone controversial joins a previously harmonious gathering. He looked exactly as I'd expected, impeccably dressed, perfectly groomed, and wearing the confident smile that had served him well in business and social situations throughout our marriage. Claudia accompanied him with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she understood the complexity of her position. "Sorry we're late," Derek announced, his voice carrying the cheerful authority he'd always used to smooth over inconveniences. "Traffic on 95 was absolutely brutal. You know how it gets on Friday evenings." The excuse was both plausible and irrelevant, but it provided everyone with an acceptable explanation that avoided acknowledging the deeper reasons why his arrival might have been delayed. Derek had never been comfortable with emotional complexity, preferring explanations that reduced human behavior to simple manageable factors. Natalie performed introductions with the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment mentally, presenting Claudia to Connor's family as Derek's partner, while carefully avoiding any title that might highlight the circumstances of their relationship. Claudia, to her credit, handled the awkwardness with more grace than I'd expected, acknowledging the situation's complexity without attempting to minimize it. "It's lovely to finally meet Connor's family," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Natalie and Connor's wedding was absolutely beautiful. You must be very proud of them." The reference to the wedding created another moment of tension, since everyone present understood that Derek's behavior on that day had been the catalyst for our current arrangement. But Connor's mother responded with diplomatic warmth, focusing on shared joy in the young couple's happiness rather than dwelling on uncomfortable history. Derek's greeting to me was carefully neutral, the kind of polite acknowledgement that suggested we were casual acquaintances rather than former spouses. "Vanessa, you look well. I hope you're doing all right with everything." His tone carried a subtle implication that I might be struggling with our divorce, a suggestion that I found both presumptuous and revealing. The Derek I'd been married to had genuinely believed that his departure would leave me helpless and diminished, unable to function without his guidance and support. "I'm doing exceptionally well, actually," I replied, my voice carrying the kind of warm confidence that comes from absolute honesty. "The catering business has been incredibly fulfilling, and I've discovered I have a real talent for helping people create meaningful celebrations. It's wonderful when you find work that feels more like calling than obligation." The response was truthful but also strategic, establishing my professional success while subtly highlighting the contrast between fulfilling work and the obligations that had characterized our marriage. Derek's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, suggesting he'd registered the implication even if he couldn't address it directly. Dinner conversation flowed more smoothly once everyone had settled into their roles for the evening. Connor regaled us with stories from his new position at the consulting firm, while Natalie shared updates about her own career advancement and their plans for purchasing their first home. The normalcy of young married life provided safe territory for discussion that avoided the landmines of family history. Derek contributed to conversations with his characteristic blend of knowledge and authority, offering advice about real estate markets and career strategies that demonstrated his continued success in business. Yet something in his manner seemed slightly forced, as if he were working harder than usual to maintain his position as the experienced elder offering wisdom to the younger generation. Claudia remained relatively quiet throughout most of the meal, contributing appropriate responses without attempting to dominate conversations or establish herself as an equal participant in family dynamics. Her restraint suggested emotional intelligence about her complex position, though I suspected it also reflected genuine discomfort with the situation she'd helped create. The food itself was exceptional, worthy of the restaurant's reputation, and providing a neutral topic for appreciation when conversation threatened to become strained. Connor's father, a wine enthusiast, had selected bottles that paired beautifully with each course, creating an atmosphere of celebration that gradually relaxed the underlying tensions. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing Derek with the kind of analytical detachment that would have been impossible during our marriage. The man sitting across from me was undeniably the same person I'd been married to for 23 years, but our changed relationship allowed me to see him more clearly than I ever had while emotionally invested in our partnership. His charm remained intact, but it seemed more calculated now, as if he were performing the role of successful businessman rather than simply being one. His attention to Claudia was attentive but careful, suggesting a relationship that hadn't yet achieved the comfortable intimacy that comes from complete security. Most tellingly, his eyes kept returning to me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something that combined assessment with what might have been regret. When Natalie announced that she'd asked both Derek and me to offer toasts celebrating her and Connor's first anniversary, my heart rate elevated slightly despite months of mental preparation. This moment had been inevitable since accepting the dinner invitation, the opportunity to address our assembled family while Derek sat just feet away, forced to listen as I defined our shared history according to my own understanding. Derek raised his glass first, delivering remarks that were gracious and appropriate, focusing on Connor's character and Natalie's happiness while avoiding any reference to marriage as an institution or love as a permanent bond. His toast was perfectly adequate, the kind of safe, conventional sentiment that would offend no one while inspiring no one either. When Natalie turned to me with expectant eyes, I rose from my chair with the kind of calm confidence that surprised even me. The words I'd crafted over weeks of preparation had been refined and polished until they felt both natural and inevitable, a perfect expression of everything I wanted to say to this particular audience at this particular moment. Natalie and Connor, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the intimate dining space. Your love story reminds us that the most beautiful relationships are built on a foundation of genuine friendship, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment to each other's happiness and growth. The opening was conventional enough to seem innocent, but the emphasis on mutual respect and unwavering commitment had been carefully chosen to highlight virtues that Derek had conspicuously failed to demonstrate during our marriage. I paused briefly, allowing the words to settle before continuing. When I look at you two together, I see a partnership where both people choose each other every single day, not just during the easy moments but especially during challenges that test your character and reveal your true values. Your love is the kind that grows stronger under pressure rather than fracturing when circumstances become difficult. Derek's expression had become increasingly tense as he recognized the direction of my remarks, though nothing I'd said could be interpreted as directly critical of him. The beauty of my approach was that every word rang true about Natalie and Connor's relationship, while implicitly condemning the failures that had destroyed my marriage. True partnership requires courage, I continued, warming to my theme as I felt the attention of everyone at the table. The courage to be completely honest with each other, even when that honesty requires difficult conversations. The courage to prioritize your relationship over individual convenience or momentary desires. And the courage to honor your commitments even when keeping them requires sacrifice. Claudia had begun studying her hands intently, apparently recognizing that she was hearing a dissertation on virtues that her relationship with Derek had violated from its inception. Derek himself sat frozen, his face carefully neutral, but his body language broadcasting discomfort that bordered on panic. Watching you build your life together has reminded me that love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose to create through daily acts of kindness, consideration, and loyalty. It's showing up for each other consistently, especially during moments when showing up is inconvenient or difficult. The words hung in the air with crystalline clarity, each syllable precisely enunciated and laden with meaning that extended far beyond wedding anniversary wishes. I had effectively delivered a masterclass in marital virtues that served as an indictment of Derek's character without ever mentioning his name or our failed relationship directly. So here's to Natalie and Connor, I concluded, raising my glass with a smile that felt both genuine and triumphant. May your love continue to be an example to all of us of what becomes possible when two people commit completely to each other's well-being and happiness. May you always choose each other, especially when that choice requires the kind of character and integrity that true love demands. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Connor's parents applauded with obvious appreciation for both the sentiment and the eloquence of its expression. Natalie's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table to squeeze my hand, clearly moved by what she'd heard as pure celebration of her marriage, rather than subtle commentary on her father's failures. Even Claudia managed to smile and raised her glass, though her expression suggested she understood perfectly well that she'd just witnessed a masterful example of how to deliver devastating criticism while maintaining perfect social grace. Derek raised his glass mechanically, his face a mask of forced pleasantness that couldn't quite conceal his recognition that he'd been thoroughly and publicly diminished. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of congratulations and appreciation for my toast, with Connor's mother commenting that she'd never heard marriage described more beautifully or meaningfully. Derek contributed little to subsequent conversations, seemingly lost in thought or perhaps struggling to process the implications of what he'd witnessed. When we finally prepared to leave, Derek approached me in the restaurant's foyer while others were retrieving coats and saying final goodbyes. His expression carried a combination of wounded pride and grudging recognition that caught me off guard with its vulnerability. "That was quite a speech," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "Very eloquent, very pointed. It was a toast celebrating our daughter's marriage." I replied with perfect composure, nothing more, nothing less. He studied my face for a long moment, perhaps searching for some trace of the accommodating woman he'd abandoned 18 months earlier. What he found instead was someone who no longer needed his approval or feared his disapproval, someone who discovered her own voice and learned to use it with devastating effectiveness. "You've changed," he said finally, the observation carrying something that might have been admiration mixed with regret. "Yes," I agreed simply, "I have." Derek nodded slowly, apparently recognizing that any attempt to elaborate on his observation would only highlight the uncomfortable truth that my transformation had been necessitated by his betrayal. He walked away without another word, rejoining Claudia for their departure while I savored the satisfaction of a confrontation that had exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Driving home that night, I reflected on the evening's success with a sense of completion that I hadn't anticipated. The toast had accomplished everything I'd hoped, celebrating Natalie's happiness, demonstrating my own transformation, and subtly but thoroughly establishing Derek's moral bankruptcy for anyone perceptive enough to read between the lines. More importantly, the entire encounter had confirmed that Derek no longer possessed any power to hurt or diminish me. The woman he'd abandoned had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and infinitely more formidable than he'd ever been forced to contend with during our marriage. His recognition of that transformation had been visible and immediate, a validation more satisfying than any revenge could have provided. The phone rang as I pulled into my driveway, Margaret's name appearing on the caller display. She'd apparently been waiting for news of how the evening had unfolded, eager to hear whether her confidence in my ability to handle Derek had been justified. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. "Did you destroy him with grace and style?" "Even better," I replied, unable to suppress the satisfaction in my voice. "I made him realize exactly what he threw away, and I did it while giving the most beautiful toast about love and commitment that's ever been delivered at an anniversary dinner." Margaret's laughter carried pride and vindication. "I knew you had it in you. That man has no idea who he was married to, does he?" "No," I agreed, looking up at the house that had become truly mine over the past 18 months, "but he does now." The weeks following the anniversary dinner brought an unexpected flood of responses that confirmed the impact of my carefully crafted toast. Natalie called the next morning, her voice bubbling with excitement about how everyone had praised the beautiful words about love and marriage. Connor's mother had apparently spent the drive home discussing the eloquence of my speech, while his father had remarked that he'd never heard commitment described with such clarity and power. What none of them mentioned directly, but what hung in the air during every conversation, was how Derek had seemed diminished by the contrast. Several guests had commented privately to Natalie about how well I was doing, how confident and articulate I'd become, how obvious it was that I'd found my footing in life after the divorce. The subtext was clear: Derek had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Margaret greeted me Monday morning with a knowing smirk, and a cup of coffee prepared exactly how I liked it. Word had apparently traveled through our social network with impressive speed, reaching her through multiple sources who'd heard second-hand accounts of the evening. "Mrs. Phillips called me yesterday," she announced, referring to one of our most prestigious clients. "She'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone else that you delivered the most devastating display of class and intelligence anyone had witnessed in years. Her exact words were that you'd made Derek look like a fool without ever raising your voice or saying an unkind word." The validation felt intoxicating, confirmation that my careful strategy had achieved exactly the effect I'd intended. More importantly, it established my reputation within our extended social circle as someone who possessed both intelligence and restraint, qualities that would serve Harvest Moon well as we continued expanding our client base. But the most significant response came from an entirely unexpected source. 3 days after the anniversary dinner, I received a phone call from Patricia with news that left me genuinely speechless. "Derek's been trying to reach you," she announced without preamble. "He called me asking for your direct number, which I obviously didn't give him." But Vanessa, he sounded different. Subdued. Almost desperate. The idea of Derek feeling desperate seemed so foreign to his character that I initially dismissed Patricia's assessment as wishful thinking. Throughout our marriage, he'd possessed unwavering confidence in his own judgment and an almost pathological inability to admit mistakes. The notion that my toast had affected him so profoundly challenged everything I understood about his personality. "What exactly did he say?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my determination to remain indifferent to his emotional state. "He said he needed to talk to you about something important. Something he should have said a long time ago. He mentioned making amends, which is language I've never heard him use about anything." Patricia's voice carried a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. "I told him that if he had something to say, he could say it through your attorney like a civilized human being." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia speculating about Derek's motives while I wrestled with my own conflicted feelings. Part of me felt vindicated by evidence that my transformation had affected him so dramatically. Another part worried that any contact with Derek would somehow diminish the psychological victory I'd achieved through maintaining perfect composure during our public encounter. Ultimately, I decided that curiosity outweighed caution. If Derek wanted to grovel or apologize, or attempt some pathetic reconciliation, I was strong enough now to handle whatever emotional manipulation he might attempt. More importantly, hearing his admissions of failure directly might provide the final closure I needed to move completely beyond our shared history. I instructed Catherine Mills to inform Derek's attorney that I would accept one supervised meeting to hear whatever he felt compelled to communicate. The parameters were clear: neutral location, time-limited discussion, no expectation of ongoing dialogue beyond this single conversation. Catherine would be present to ensure that nothing Derek said could be construed as harassment or manipulation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at Catherine's office, a setting that provided both security and formality. I spent the intervening days focusing intensively on work, using the demanding schedule of 3 simultaneous events to avoid dwelling on what Derek might possibly have to say that could justify disrupting the peace I'd worked so hard to achieve. Margaret proved invaluable during this period, providing both practical support with our increased workload and emotional grounding when my thoughts threatened to spiral into speculation about Derek's motives. Her perspective, shaped by her own difficult divorce years earlier, helped me maintain realistic expectations about whatever drama might unfold. "Men like Derek don't fundamentally change," she reminded me during one of our morning coffee sessions. "They just occasionally realize they've made strategic errors that have cost them more than they anticipated. Whatever he wants to say, remember that it's about his needs, not yours." Her warning proved prescient when Derek appeared at Catherine's office looking distinctly uncomfortable and significantly older than he'd seemed just weeks earlier. The confident businessman who'd charmed guests at anniversary dinner had been replaced by someone who appeared genuinely uncertain about his reception and his mission. Catherine managed the preliminary formalities with professional efficiency, establishing ground rules for the conversation while making clear that I was under no obligation to respond to anything Derek chose to share. The protective framework allowed me to observe Derek's obvious discomfort with detached curiosity rather than emotional investment. Vanessa, Derek began, his voice lacking its usual authority. I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know I don't deserve your time or attention, especially after how I behaved. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing was so unprecedented that it caught me completely off guard. The Derek I'd been married to had possessed an almost supernatural ability to rationalize his choices and deflect responsibility for negative consequences. Hearing him accept blame directly felt like witnessing a fundamental alteration of his personality. I've spent the past 2 years telling myself that our marriage had run its course naturally, that we'd simply grown apart in ways that made separation inevitable. He continued, his hands fidgeting with documents he'd placed on the conference table. But listening to your toast, hearing how you described real commitment and genuine partnership, made me realize how wrong I'd been about everything. Catherine maintained perfect professional neutrality, but I could sense her surprise at Derek's unprecedented humility. This was not the arrogant, defensive man who'd characterized their previous interactions during divorce proceedings. Someone had apparently forced Derek to confront uncomfortable truths about his own behavior and motivations. You were right about what love requires, Derek said, his voice growing stronger as he continued. The courage to be honest, to show up consistently, to prioritize the relationship over individual convenience. I failed at all of those things, not just at the end but throughout most of our marriage. The admission was both gratifying and irrelevant. Yes, Derek had failed as a husband in precisely the ways my toast had outlined. But acknowledging those failures after abandoning our marriage was meaningless except as an exercise in delayed emotional development. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Derek continued, apparently reading my skeptical expression. I know I destroyed any right to that when I chose to leave the way I did, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the magnitude of what I threw away, and I take full responsibility for the pain I caused. His words carried genuine emotion, but they also felt rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this speech multiple times before delivering it. I found myself wondering whether his newfound humility reflected authentic growth or simply strategic positioning for some larger agenda. The truth is, Derek said, his voice dropping to near whisper volume. Claudia ended our relationship 3 months ago. She said I was emotionally unavailable and still obviously obsessed with my ex-wife. She was right about both things. This revelation recontextualized everything about Derek's apparent transformation. His humility wasn't the product of moral awakening, but rather the consequence of romantic failure. Claudia had apparently recognized what I'd learned through painful experience. Derek was incapable of genuine emotional intimacy, and would inevitably disappoint anyone who expected authentic connection. I'm sorry that your relationship didn't work out, I said carefully, choosing my words to convey polite sympathy without suggesting any personal investment in his emotional state. Breakups are always difficult, regardless of the circumstances. Derek's face registered surprise at my composed response, perhaps expecting more satisfaction or vindication than I'd displayed. The Derek I'd been married to would have been shocked by my lack of emotional reaction to news that his affair had failed spectacularly. I've been seeing a therapist, Derek continued, apparently determined to share his entire journey of belated self-discovery. She's helped me understand patterns in my behavior that I'd never recognized before. The way I've used work to avoid emotional intimacy, how I've consistently chosen superficial attractions over deeper connections, why I've always sabotaged relationships when they required genuine vulnerability. The psychological insights were accurate but irrelevant to my current life. Derek's therapeutic breakthrough might benefit his future relationships, but it couldn't repair the damage he'd caused to our marriage, or justify the cruelty of his departure. I'm glad you're getting the help you need. I replied with the same tone I'd used to acknowledge a casual acquaintance medical treatment. Self-awareness is always valuable, regardless of when it arrives. My polite indifference seemed to unnerve Derek more than anger would have. He'd apparently expected our meeting to provoke strong emotional responses that would indicate I still cared enough about his welfare to be hurt or pleased by his revelations. The thing is, Derek said, his voice taking on a note of desperation that confirmed Margaret's prediction about his underlying motives. I realize now that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. The The stability you provided, the way you supported my career while managing our entire personal life, your intelligence and grace in social situations. I took all of that for granted because I was too immature to recognize its value. There it was, the real purpose of this meeting. Derek hadn't sought me out to apologize, but to attempt some form of reconciliation now that his grand romantic adventure had collapsed. His newfound appreciation for my qualities was entirely self-serving, motivated by recognition that replacing me would be impossible rather than genuine regret for his treatment of me. Derek, I said, gently but firmly, I appreciate your honesty about recognizing my contributions to our marriage. But that recognition doesn't change anything between us. I've built a completely different life now, one that makes me happier than I ever was during our relationship. His face registered shock at this assertion, as if the possibility that I might prefer my post-divorce existence had never occurred to him. The Derek I'd known had always assumed that his presence improved any situation he entered, that others should feel grateful for his attention and devastated by his absence. You can't mean that, Derek said, his composure finally cracking. 23 years of marriage, Vanessa, our shared history, the life we built together, our daughter, that has to count for something. It counts as a chapter of my life that taught me important lessons about what I need and deserve from relationships, I replied calmly. But it's a completed chapter. I'm not interested in revisiting it, or attempting to rewrite its ending. Catherine intervened then, noting that our agreed-upon time limit was approaching and asking whether Derek had any final points he needed to address. His desperation became palpable as he realized that his carefully planned reconciliation attempt had failed to generate any openness on my part. Is there anything I could do or say that would make you consider giving us another chance? Derek asked directly, abandoning any pretense of seeking closure rather than reunion. I know I'd have to earn your trust back, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The question crystallized everything I'd learned about myself and relationships during the past 2 years. The woman Derek had abandoned might have been tempted by his apparent transformation and promises of change. But the woman I'd become understood that genuine compatibility couldn't be manufactured through willpower and good intentions. No, I said, simply. There isn't anything you could do or say that would change my mind. I don't want to be married to you anymore, Derek. Not because I'm angry or hurt, but because I've discovered I like myself and my life better without you in it. The finality of my statement seemed to physically impact Derek, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the reality that his last-ditch effort had accomplished nothing beyond confirming his irrelevance to my future. Catherine concluded the meeting with professional efficiency, though I could see approval in her expression at how completely I'd maintained my boundaries. Derek left the office looking defeated and confused, apparently struggling to understand how the accommodating wife he'd controlled for decades had transformed into someone immune to his charm and indifferent to his suffering. His inability to accept my disinterest confirmed everything I'd learned about his fundamentally selfish nature. Driving back to Harvest Moon after the meeting, I felt a profound sense of liberation that exceeded even the satisfaction I'd experienced after delivering my anniversary toast. Derek's desperate attempt at reconciliation had provided irrefutable proof that I'd not only survived his abandonment, but had actually benefited from it in ways that threatened his entire self-concept. Margaret was waiting with champagne when I arrived, having apparently anticipated that Derek's meeting would represent the final closure I needed to move completely beyond our shared past. Her celebration felt perfectly appropriate for what amounted to my graduation from victim to victor in the most comprehensive possible way. How does it feel to have him begging for forgiveness? She asked as we toasted my psychological victory. Irrelevant, I replied honestly. It feels completely irrelevant. The months that followed Derek's failed reconciliation attempt brought continued expansion and success for Harvest Moon, along with personal growth that surprised even me. My confidence in professional settings had evolved into broader self-assurance that affected every aspect of my life. I'd begun dating again, cautiously but with clear standards about the kind of partnership I would and wouldn't accept. The men I met through various social and professional connections found themselves dealing with someone who possessed firm boundaries and realistic expectations, qualities that attracted healthy relationships while repelling potential manipulators. My experience with Derek had provided invaluable education about red flags and warning signs that I now recognized immediately. One relationship in particular had begun developing into something that felt genuinely promising. James Morrison was a landscape architect who'd been recommended by Connor's father when Natalie and Connor began planning extensive gardens for their new home. Our initial interactions had been purely professional, but mutual attraction and compatible values had gradually evolved into something more personal. James possessed qualities that I now recognized as essential for my happiness: emotional intelligence, genuine curiosity about my thoughts and opinions, and secure enough in his own achievements to celebrate mine without feeling threatened. He also demonstrated the kind of consistent reliability that Derek had never managed, following through on commitments and showing up when expected. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately, with both of us bringing the wisdom of previous romantic failures to our growing connection. James had been divorced for 5 years, following his own experience with an unfaithful spouse, giving him realistic understanding of trust issues and the work required to build genuine intimacy. Most importantly, James seemed genuinely fascinated by the woman I'd become through my professional success and personal transformation. Unlike Derek, who'd always seemed more comfortable with the accommodating wife version of me, James appreciated my opinions, sought my advice, and encouraged my continued growth. When James proposed on a brilliant October morning, almost exactly 3 years after Derek's wedding day abandonment, the symmetry felt like cosmic justice. We were standing in the gardens he'd designed for our shared home, surrounded by the late-season blooms that represented cycles of renewal and regeneration. "I know we've both learned to be cautious about marriage," James said, as he presented a ring that perfectly reflected my evolved taste and style. "But I also know that what we've built together is worth protecting and celebrating officially. Will you marry me, Vanessa?" The proposal felt completely different from Derek's decades earlier, rooted in mutual respect and shared vision, rather than conventional expectations and social pressure. James wasn't asking me to complete his life or provide services he couldn't manage independently. He was inviting me to formalize a partnership that enhanced both our individual strengths. Planning our wedding became a joyful collaboration that showcased everything I'd learned about creating meaningful celebrations through my work with Harvest Moon. Margaret handled the catering with her characteristic blend of creativity and precision, while I coordinated other vendors and managed logistics with the expertise I'd developed over 3 years of professional practice. Natalie served as my matron of honor, her enthusiasm for my happiness reflecting her own experience of successful marriage, and her relief that I'd found genuine partnership after Derek's betrayal. Connor stood as one of James's groomsmen, their friendship having deepened through shared recognition of what authentic commitment requires. The guest list included colleagues from Harvest Moon, clients who'd become friends, and neighbors who'd supported me through the difficult transition period following my divorce. Notably absent were most of the couples Derek and I had socialized with during our marriage, relationships that had proven to be based more on social convenience than genuine affection. Derek received an invitation, partly from Natalie's diplomatic desire to avoid family drama, and partly from my own confidence that his presence couldn't diminish my joy in any way. His response came through his attorney, declining attendance while expressing wishes for my happiness that felt both formal and genuinely meant. The ceremony itself took place in the gardens James had designed, surrounded by friends and family, who'd witnessed various stages of my transformation from abandoned wife to successful businesswoman to happy bride. The vows James and I exchanged reflected our mature understanding of what marriage could be when built on mutual respect and realistic expectations. "I promise to encourage your continued growth and independence," I told James as we stood beneath an arbor of late roses. "To celebrate your achievements without feeling threatened, to support your dreams while pursuing my own, and to choose our partnership every day because it makes both our lives richer and more meaningful." His responding vows carried similar themes of mutual support and individual autonomy within committed partnership, reflecting our shared belief that the strongest marriages enhance rather than constrain the people within them. The reception featured Harvest Moon's signature combination of elegant food and flawless service, with Margaret and her team executing every detail perfectly, while allowing me to focus entirely on celebrating with our guests. The evening felt like a testament to everything I'd built from the ashes of Derek's abandonment, proof that apparent disasters can become the foundation for something far better than what they destroyed. During the father-daughter dance that tradition would have reserved for Derek, I chose instead to dance with Connor, honoring the son-in-law, who'd become a genuine friend and supporter during my most difficult period. The gesture represented my conscious choice to create new traditions based on current relationships rather than historical obligations. "Thank you for showing Natalie and me what real partnership looks like," Connor said as we moved to the music. Watching you rebuild your life and find love again has been inspiring for both of us. You've set an example of resilience that I hope we never need, but are grateful to have witnessed. The compliment meant more to me than any professional recognition could have. Confirmation that my journey had influenced the next generation's understanding of what to expect and demand from intimate relationships. As the evening wound down and James and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon in Italy, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with Derek's wedding day betrayal. The woman who'd been abandoned in Riverside 3 years earlier bore little resemblance to the confident bride, departing for her second chance at happiness. Everything Derek had intended to destroy through his cruel departure had instead been rebuilt stronger and more authentic than before. My professional success exceeded anything I'd achieved during our marriage. My relationships were deeper and more genuine, and my sense of self-worth was no longer dependent on anyone else's approval or presence. Margaret pulled me aside as we gathered our belongings, her eyes bright with tears of joy and satisfaction. "Do you remember what I told you that first day you came to work for me?" she asked. "That sometimes we need our old life to completely fall apart before we can build something better." I nodded, remembering her words, and how impossible they'd seemed at the time. "Look around," Margaret continued, gesturing toward the celebration we'd created. "Look at everything you've built. Derek thought he was punishing you when he drove away from Natalie's wedding. Instead, he set you free to become the woman you were always meant to be." Her words crystallized everything I'd learned about resilience and renewal through the past 3 years. Derek's betrayal had indeed been a gift, though not one he'd intended to give. By destroying the comfortable but limiting life we'd shared, he'd forced me to discover capabilities and strengths I would never have explored otherwise. As James and I drove away from our wedding reception, I felt no anger toward Derek, no satisfaction in his continued struggles with loneliness and regret. His life had become irrelevant to mine, except as the catalyst that had sparked my transformation into someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely happier than the woman he'd abandoned. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities that I would navigate as an equal partner with someone who valued my independence as much as my commitment. The business I'd built would continue growing, the relationships I'd cultivated would deepen over time, and the confidence I'd earned through surviving Derek's worst would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Sometimes the cruelest actions yield the greatest gift. Derek had meant to teach me a lesson about dependence and humility. Instead, he'd accidentally provided me with the motivation to discover my own strength, and the opportunity to build a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything our marriage had offered. Sitting beside James as we began our honeymoon journey, I realized that Derek's wedding day abandonment had been the best thing that ever happened to me. He'd intended to break me, but had instead set me free to become exactly who I was meant to be, and for that unintended gift, I would always be grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.